Policy Agreement 2 between the two parties. Election fraud. This one is a tough one. Not because there's a lack of evidence to support the idea that there is election fraud in the United States, but because it goes against the core beliefs of many Americans that their election system is honest, open, fair, and accurate. Sometimes people who hold a core belief that is very strong, when they are presented with evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable, called cognitive dissonance. And because it's so important to protect the core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, even deny anything that doesn't fit in with the core belief. At this point, though, we want to distinguish between election fraud and voter fraud, since many people are confused about the two. Voter fraud is when you vote in an illegal way. One example includes voting if you're not a citizen. Another example of voter fraud would be if you live with your mom, both ballots arrive in the mail, you open up both your ballot and your mom's ballot, and you vote for both of you, forge her signature, and turn in both ballots, thus getting 2 votes for yourself. This is obviously illegal, but it's not very common. Getting people motivated enough to vote once is difficult enough. By contrast, however, election fraud is when you tamper with the election system in some way, such as rigging voting machines, purging voters from the rolls, changing vote totals in the database, rounding up and rounding down the number of votes for a specific candidate, and more. How easy is it to rig an election anyway? Well, it all adds up. Part 1. Soft election fraud. What do we mean by soft election fraud? This would include any process which would make the election unfair in some way, but not so direct as to tamper with vote totals or databases, or anything like that. This could include examples such as manipulated media coverage, cutting the number of polling places, long waits in line to vote, long waits between registering to vote and being able to vote, requiring party registration in order to vote, and more. Let's use a specific example. Democratic Party superdelegates. What are superdelegates? In the presidential primaries in the Democratic Party, when you go to vote, around 85% of the delegates to the DNC convention, where the final candidate is chosen to be the presidential nominee, are representative of the voters. However, around 15% of these delegates that choose the presidential nominee are superdelegates. These are party officials, lobbyists, former governors, congressmen, who have been chosen by party insiders to be delegates. What is the purpose of these superdelegates? It's to make sure that the Democratic Party remains in control of the insiders and party bosses so that no grassroots movement can take over the party. Former DNC chair Debbie Wasserman Schultz admitted as much during the 2016 election. She was DNC chair at the time.
Hillary Clinton lost to Bernie Sanders in New Hampshire by 22 percentage points, the biggest victory in a contested Democratic primary there since John F. Kennedy. But it looks as though Clinton and Sanders are leaving the Granite State with the same number of delegates in their pockets because Clinton has the support of New Hampshire's superdelegates, these party insiders. What do you tell voters who are new to the process who says this makes them feel like it's all rigged?
Well, let me just make sure that I can clarify exactly what was available during the primaries in Iowa and in New Hampshire. The unpledged delegates are a separate category. The only thing available on the ballot in a primary and a caucus is the pledged delegates, those that are tied to the candidate that they are pledged to support, and they receive a proportional number of delegates going into our convention. Unpledged delegates exist really to make sure that party leaders and elected officials don't have to be in a position where they are running against grassroots activists. Unpledged delegates exist really to make sure that party leaders and elected officials don't have to be in a position where they are running against grassroots activists. We are, as a Democratic Party, really highlight and emphasize inclusiveness and diversity at our convention, and so we want to give every opportunity to grassroots activists and diverse, committed Democrats to be able to participate, attend, and be a delegate at the convention. And so we separate out those unpledged delegates to make sure that there isn't competition between them.
I'm not sure that answer would satisfy an anxious young voter, but
Superdelegates have been part of the Democratic Party presidential primary process since 1984. However, the origins of the superdelegates go back further. With the 1968 Democratic National Convention, pro-Vietnam War liberal Hubert Humphrey was nominated for the presidency despite not running in a single primary election or caucus. The Democratic Party made changes in its delegate selection process to correct what primary voters saw as unfair control of the nomination process by party bosses. The McGovern-Fraser Commission, headed by South Dakota Senator George McGovern and Minnesota Representative Donald M. Fraser, met in 1969 and 1970 and shifted the balance of power to primary elections and caucuses, mandating that all delegates be chosen via mechanisms open to all party members. The Democrats proved largely unsuccessful at the ballot box, however, with the 1972 presidential campaign of McGovern and the 1980 re-election campaign of Jimmy Carter, which both resulted in landslide defeats. A new 70-member commission headed by North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt was appointed to further change the Democratic Party's nomination process, attempting to balance the wishes of rank-and-file Democrats with the collective wisdom of party leaders, and to thereby avoid the nomination of an insurgent candidate. Following a series of meetings held from August 1981 to February 1982, the Hunt Commission recommended the idea of superdelegates. With the original Hunt plan, superdelegates were to represent 30% of all delegates to the National Convention. But when it was actually implemented by the Democratic National Committee for the 1984 election, the number of superdelegates was set at around 14%. Over time, this percentage has gradually increased, until by 2008, the percentage stood at approximately 20% of total delegates to the Democratic Party nominating convention. What is the problem with superdelegates? Well, they make up anywhere from 15 to 20% of the primary vote when deciding who presidential nominee for the Democratic Party will be. This could easily swing an election against the will of the voters. Many elections are within a 15% margin. When it really matters, the superdelegates can tip the scales in favor of party insiders. This, in our view, is soft election fraud. On the Republican side, we have winner-take-all primaries, which is different than the Democratic Party. This means that delegates chosen to go to the National Republican Convention are chosen based on who won the state rather than proportional representation. This means that if you won the state, whatever state it is, by a 51-49% election where you won by 1% as a presidential candidate, you'd receive 100% of the delegates from that state. Instead, on the Democratic Party side, where you'd receive 51% of the delegates from that state instead of 100%, minus the superdelegate. Why is winner-take-all a bad system in terms of the election of presidential candidates? Because it does not give a fair representation of the will of the voters. Since a presidential candidate gets 100% of the delegates in a state where they won by 1% of the vote, that means that 49% of the residents from this very same state, hypothetically, don't have their voices heard. Let's move on to another example, controlling the presidential debates. For many Americans who don't follow politics or government operations very closely, the presidential debates are sometimes the first and only time that citizens will hear and get to know each of the presidential candidates and debate policy issues. This is why both the Democrats and the Republicans work together, literally, to control the presidential debate process. How do they do this? Through the Commission on Presidential Debates. The Commission on Presidential Debates, or CPD, is an independent nonprofit organization established in 1987. Their operations are funded jointly by both political parties. Since both parties fund the CPD, they effectively have a monopoly over the presidential debate process. Both parties have used this to control to keep third-party candidates out of the debates. In the year 2000, the CPD established a rule that for a candidate to be included in the national debates, they must have at least 15% support across 5 national polls. In 2003, a nonprofit organization called Open Debates was formed to advocate for debates that included third parties and allowed exchanges amongst the candidates. Open Debates criticized the CPD for collusion between the two political parties. One example includes the 2012 election, where the Romney campaign and the Obama campaign signed a contract with the CPD called a Memo of Understanding, which informed both candidates of the debate topics in advance, who would host them, and set strict rules for the candidates, such as not being able to ask direct questions of the other candidate, seating arrangements, what questions will and will not be asked, and more. On October 8th, 2004, 2 presidential candidates, Libertarian candidate Michael Badnarik and Green Party candidate David Cobb, were arrested while protesting the Commission on Presidential Debates for excluding third-party candidates from the nationally televised debates in St. Louis, Missouri. On October 16, 2012, Green Party presidential nominee Jill Stein and Green Party vice presidential nominee Sherry Honkala were arrested for disorderly conduct while trying to take part in the second presidential debate in Hempstead, New York. The 2 women were taken to a warehouse and for around 8 hours were strapped to chairs with plastic wrist restraints before being released. The CPD has had multiple lawsuits filed against them as well. In the 2000 election, Green Party candidate Ralph Nader filed a complaint with the FEC on the basis that corporate contributions to the CPD violate the Federal Election Campaign Act. The FEC ruled that the CPD's funding sources did not violate the Federal Election Campaign Act. In 2012, Libertarian presidential candidate Gary Johnson filed an antitrust lawsuit against the CPD, citing the Sherman Antitrust Act. The case was dismissed in 2014 by the D.C. Circuit Court. In September 2015, the Libertarian and Green parties filed another lawsuit against the CPD, the Democratic National Committee, the Republican National Committee, Barack Obama, and Mitt Romney, citing violation of federal antitrust laws. The case was dismissed in August 2016. By controlling the debate process, the 2 major parties have been able to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but to allow a very lively debate within that spectrum. This is why the policies, debate topics, and types of candidates never change, and the general public doesn't hear very many new ideas from their elected officials. Let's move on to another example of soft election fraud: legalized bribery, also known as money in politics. This has been a problem in American politics for quite some time, but has accelerated in recent years with the Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission Supreme Court decision in 2010, which opened the door for unlimited election spending by corporations to super PACs. The ruling brought a new era of corporate influence in politics, allowing companies, business people, and billionaires to buy elections to promote their financial interests. When corporations and governments mix, both become corrupted, not just the government, both. This is why politicians, especially at the national level, don't actually implement policies to benefit the people. They implement policies to benefit their donors. That's why politicians that take money from the health insurance industry don't want universal health care. That's why politicians that take money from the oil companies don't implement practical environmental policies. It's why almost all of the politicians are pro-war, because they're all receiving some money from military companies or billionaires that support the military. All these politicians have already been bought out. There are countless examples. Bribing politicians is a form of soft election fraud. Both parties agree that it's okay because they both represent corporations and billionaires and their financial interests. And corporations and billionaires want to continue to buy out the political process even further. Billionaire Warren Buffett even went so far as to say that the billionaire class has won the class war.
About millionaires, about the uber rich paying their fair share of taxes. But since you know, since the portion of their taxes really isn't going to make a huge dent in the deficit, are you happy seeing your suggestion, this new Buffett rule, becoming more of a basis of a political battle that really has turned into class warfare?
Well, no, actually, there's been class warfare going on for the last 20 years, and my class is one. We're the ones that have gotten our tax rates reduced dramatically.
Let's take a look at another form of soft election fraud: manipulated media coverage. In 1983, 90% of U.S. media was owned by 50 companies. Now 90% of U.S. media is controlled by 6 giant media companies. These 6 companies are General Electric, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, and CBS. These media companies and their various owners also give money to political campaigns from both political parties. This is a major conflict of interest. It means a company like Comcast, who owns NBC, can give money to a political campaign for their preferred candidate, and then use their media influence to trick the public and cover an election in a manipulated way in order to get their preferred candidate to win. And then once their preferred candidate does win, the politician can turn around and pass laws and policies that benefit the company who just buttered them up, Comcast. A recent example of this happened during the 2016 Democratic primary when MSNBC's Chris Matthews said that they would announce Hillary Clinton the winner in California primary before the polls even closed.
Trouble I'm about to start here. I'm told by the experts on numbers around here at NBC and elsewhere that come June 7th, the day of the California primary, which your candidate, I totally understand, wants to get to and maybe have a chance of knocking off Hillary at that event, a big last hurrah, that at 8 o'clock that night Eastern time, the networks will be prepared, including this one, to announce that Hillary Clinton has now gotten over the top, that she will have won the nomination in numbers. It's done. What will that do to turnout if that's 5 o'clock Pacific time with 3 more hours to vote in California? Who will be least likely to vote? Sanders people from 5 to 8 people or Hillary? I've heard both theories.
Well, I think
your candidate?
Well, I think it'll depress turnout on both sides. Whenever there's no contest, I think you get depressed turnout on both sides. But it'll be an inaccurate description of the state of the race.
The major corporate media companies will also use a technique known as astroturfing. In other words, fake grassroots movements and organizations for the purposes of manipulating the public to support one position or another. In the modern era, these techniques are even more sophisticated. Social media, like Facebook for example, has computer algorithms that are able to measure patterns of thought online and use that data to manipulate what people see and hear. The algorithms can also be set up to organize people into bubbles, where you don't work together with other groups, and where you only see posts from things you like and block things you don't like. Every time you like something or block somebody, you're giving the machine more information. That information can be used in a countless number of ways. It still hasn't fully played out yet. Part 2. Hard election fraud. Rigged voting machines. In 2006, Princeton University's Center for Information Technology Policy performed a security analysis of the Diebold AccuVote TS voting machine. The main findings of the security analysis were as follows. Malicious software running on a single voting machine can steal votes with little, if any, risk of detection. The malicious software can modify all of the records, audit logs, and counters kept by the voting machine, so that even careful forensic examination of these records will find nothing amiss. We have constructed demonstration software that carries out this vote-stealing attack. Anyone who has physical access to a voting machine or memory card will later be inserted into the machine, can install said malicious software using a simple method that takes as little as 1 minute. In practice, poll workers and others often have unsupervised access to the machines. AccuVote TS machines are susceptible to voting machine computer viruses that can spread malicious software automatically and invisibly from machine to machine during normal pre- and post-election activities. We have constructed a demonstration virus that spreads in this way, installing our demonstration vote-stealing program on every machine it infects. While some of these problems can be eliminated by improving Diebold software, others cannot be remedied without replacing the machine's hardware. Changes to the election procedures would also be required to ensure security. Diebold responded to the study, stating, Diebold strongly disagrees with the conclusion of the Princeton report. Secure voting equipment, proper procedures, and adequate testing assure an accurate voting process that has been confirmed through numerous stringent accuracy tests and third-party security analysis. Every voter in every local jurisdiction that uses AccuVote TS should feel secure knowing that their vote will count on election day. A number of third-party security analyses were also done on the AccuVote TS, such as the Hopkins-Rice report, the SAIC report, the RABA report, the CompuWare report. And like the Princeton report, they all came to the conclusion that the AccuVote TS has serious security problems. Something else worth noting is that the computer code that counts our votes is a private trade secret. That means that the company such as Diebold creates the code that counts our votes and does not have to release that code to the public, opening up the door to potential tampering. In the 2016 Democratic primary election, states that had a paper trail preferred Sanders over Clinton 51% to 49%. However, in states without a paper trail, Clinton was preferred 65% to Sanders 35%. Exit polls versus final results. In the 2016 presidential election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, exit poll data compiled from 28 states showed significant discrepancies between the exit polls and the final results. In Ohio, there was an 8.5% discrepancy, 5.9% in North Carolina, 5.6% in Pennsylvania, 4.9% in Wisconsin, and 2.6% in Florida, all outside the margin of error, which is 2%. In emerging democracies, exit polls are used in order to find any manipulation in the voting system. It also provides a double check to the whole vote, which improves transparency. A vote is usually considered accurate if the exit polling data is within 2% of the actual results. While swings in the general election of 8.5% are bad, exit poll discrepancies were even greater in the primaries, where there were swings as high as 14%. In all states except two, Wisconsin and Oklahoma, the final results were in Clinton's favor during the 2016 Democratic primary. Collusion between the two parties. It should be made clear that election fraud has taken place and that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump have benefited from massive election fraud in the primaries and the general election. Trump is a fraud, as was Clinton. In fact, both of their families have been close for quite some time. Bill Clinton and Donald Trump shared a golf game and a cordial chat shortly before Trump decided to run. Ivanka Trump and Chelsea Clinton are also good friends. However, they only put their friendship on ice after the 2016 elections. Trump also gave $250,000 to the Clinton Foundation. Trump and Clinton also share the same Delaware tax loophole address with 285,000 other firms. Bill Clinton also appointed Donald Trump's sister to the United States Court of Appeals in 1999. WikiLeaks leaked John Podesta emails reveal that Hillary Clinton's presidential strategy included elevating Trump as a Pied Piper candidate. The following video is of Donald Trump praising Hillary Clinton in 2012.
Hillary Clinton, I think, is a terrific woman. I mean, I'm a little biased because I've known her for years. I live in New York. She lives in New York. And I've known her and her husband for years, and I really like them both a lot. And I think she really works hard. And I think she, again, she's given an agenda that's not all of her, but I think she really works hard, and I think she does a good job, and I like her.
Do you think that she says she's out at the end of this term? You think we're going to see her again running for office? I think so. I think, assuming she's healthy, which I hope she will be, I think she probably runs after the next 4 years, I would imagine. You support her? I don't want to get into this because I'll get myself into trouble. But That's why I asked you, to see if we get into trouble. I just like her. I like her, and I like her husband. Her husband made a speech on Monday at Mar-a-Lago, and it was very well received. And he's a really good guy, and she's a really good person and woman.
When moving forward, we need to not simply replace one fraud with another. but rather to transform a system that makes fraud into an essential component rather than a rare occurrence. The system of representative democracy as we know it produces fraud as the norm rather than the exception. The problem with the system we've got, though, is that it relies on the corrupt officials to reform themselves. The voters have no direct power to overturn decisions made by these corrupt officials. At this time, many in the United States are whipped up into a state of hysteria around Russia, claiming that Russia hacked our elections in a conspiracy to get Donald Trump elected to be president. 13 Russian nationals, including Vladimir Putin's chef, have been indicted as a result of this hysteria. Shortly after the 2016 presidential elections, Vladimir Putin made the claim that Russia did not tamper in our elections. Whether Russia interfered in our election or not, it doesn't matter, because the mechanisms remain in place for our own government officials, both political parties, corporate media, billionaires, and big money to rig the election process, and it has been in place for a long time. It's not Russia doing it, it's us doing it to ourselves, but many Americans are too afraid to look in the mirror. Maybe they'd see a country that pretends to be another country. Maybe if they did look in the mirror, they'd be inspired to take direct action and correct the wrongs of a corrupt election system. Whether your vote is counted accurately or not, it's extremely important to get directly involved yourself on the issues that you and your community cares about. If you won't do it, who will?